Good morning. I'm Bob Stagnitto, and I'm interviewing this morning Dawn Lester and David Parker, who've written the book. Well, could you show the book and give the
Right,
title?
okay.
Because,
Just
like I said, I only have an ebook, so I
right.
can't hold it up.
Well, we just happen to have a copy.
Yeah,
So
great.
it's yeah, what really makes you ill? Why everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong. A challenging title, which that's deliberate, of course, because one is the first bit. What really makes you ill was the basic question we asked ourselves when we started this, and the second part, why everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong, is because that's what happened to us. Everything we thought we knew about disease was wrong.
Mhm.
And so that's why that it's titled as it is, because we assume that most people are brought up to believe the same things we were brought up to do, germs make you ill, all the rest of it. And nothing could be further from the truth. So that's the title of the book, why everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong.
Mhm.
And it was a big learning lesson for us for over 10 years, which it took to write the book.
Mhm.
So um, yeah, so we keep coming up with extra little bits, although we cover a lot in the book because it's nearly 800 pages. So we cover a lot of stuff in detail. But sometimes we want to emphasize a few things to try and dispel some misconceptions that people might have. And what we thought we might do to start with is to talk about antibodies, or the myth of antibodies, shall we say, because I'm sure everyone's familiar with the term antibodies. The medical establishment sort of bandy it about a lot, particularly in connection with immunity, and particularly in connection with vaccines, which are supposed to boost your immune system by injecting what we know as toxic material into your bloodstream, which is then supposed to produce antibodies to the whatever disease it is they think they're vaccinating you against. And then sometime in the future, um, those antibodies floating about in your system are supposed to recognize the disease when it attacks you and fight it. Well, that's all of that is a complete myth. Uh, so we thought we'd just talk a little bit about antibodies themselves as to what they really are. Um, Now, without going into too much detail, it's fair to say that it's a complete misnomer. I mean, if you look at the name antibody, it's got to be against, anti being against, so anti against something. So if they're vaccinating you against, let's say, COVID, so it'd be anti COVID. Um, so it's a bit of a misnomer anyway, because first of all, they've got to know have identified in these cases the particular virus, which we know very well they haven't. So how can you produce antibodies against something that doesn't actually exist? So it's a bit of a nonsense to start with anyway. But what these actual things are that the medical establishment call antibodies are really something called globulins, which are produced by the body. These are proteins which are produced by the body as part of its healing system. So, if even if you sort of were to cut your finger or something like that, the body wants to heal that wound, so it produces these globulins, these little proteins, which will start to heal the wound, knit it together. The scab forms, and it's part of the healing process. If cells in the body get damaged because it's had some sort of toxin introduced into the body, probably by a vaccine, then again it will produce these globulins, which are trying to heal the cells, all part of the body's natural healing system. But as usual, the medical establishment completely mistake what these are and have given the name of antibodies, because what they've seen is if the body is under attack, then the body produces more of these things. So they've just called them antibodies because they think, right, it's the body's defense. What they don't realize is it's part of the healing system. But then they sort of compound that mistake by thinking that if they give you a vaccination, the body will produce antibodies which are specific to that disease. Again, nonsense and totally unprovable, but this is what they think. And then those antibodies will stay in your system until sometime in the future when that supposed virus is going to attack your body, and it will remember it, and these antibodies are supposed to zoom in and kill it off. All unprovable and all complete nonsense. As I say, so we try not to refer to antibodies. We want to call them by their proper name, which is, as I say, globulins, which is something people can look up even on Wikipedia will tell you what globulins are. So as much as you can believe Wikipedia, that is, but even they recognize what globulins are. So that's the true nature of what these things are. So we can dispel this myth about antibodies. There's no such thing, and they don't work in the way that the medical establishment thinks they do. Mm-hmm. So no surprises there then, really, from the medical establishment's point of view. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether you want to say anything.
No, I was going to say there's actually a contradiction with the whole theory of antibodies. As David said, vaccines are supposed to produce antibodies that then they reckon helps to boost immunity. So the higher the level of antibodies, the more immunity you've got. That's the theory of behind vaccines. But there are other tests that that say that if they find antibodies, that means you've actually got an infection with whatever the virus is. So there is a complete contradiction, because they interpret antibodies in ways that are mutually exclusive. They are so for vaccines to be able to produce or increase or boost the level of antibodies means that it's supposed to confer immunity, whereas other tests that show high levels of antibodies means infection. So it simply cannot be the case, because they can't both be true. The problem is that neither of them is true. As David said, these proteins that they call antibodies are in the body for completely other reasons. But the main problem is the medical establishment has the view that the body is just a constant battleground between antibodies fighting these antigens, whether they're viruses, bacteria that are supposed to be invading the body and attacking the body. So it's just this whole kind of military view that everything is an attack and has to be defended and fought against, and that's the fundamental idea behind the medical system. Introducing treatments and vaccines that will fight disease, and this is completely the wrong idea, the wrong model. The completely wrong model, and that's where with the title of everything you know about disease is wrong, because that's not how the disease process works. It's not something that attacks the body, but these are processes that happen depending on the condition of the internal condition of the body, and the symptoms are not because you've got a disease or you have a disease or a disease has attacked you. These are conditions from within the body, because the body is doing what it does best. As David said, it's all part of the different healing mechanisms, and we have talked about the different symptoms and the fact that they represent the body's efforts to actually heal itself. It's not to do with fighting disease and these different antigens or microbes that attack the body.
I think one of the, just to sort of elaborate on something Dawn was saying there about, I think one of the clearest examples of the contradictions of the medical establishment with antibodies is the HIV/AIDS situation. I mean, under normal circumstances, the medical establishment would say, in their terms, if you've got lots of antibodies in your system, then you have immunity. Okay. When they do a test for HIV/AIDS, if you've got lots of antibodies in your system, then they say you're HIV positive. So this is a prime example of absolute rubbish that the medical establishment put out, completely in contradiction to their own sort of specifications. And I think people have pointed this out in the past, but they still carry on and do it. So people might like to just think about that a little bit.
And that's one of the things that we highlight in the book, that, you know, the number of contradictions, that if you actually look at the different statements that are made within the medical establishment, you can find quite a lot of contradictions. And we did find quite a few that just absolutely amazed us, how many statements do not match. You know, they can say one thing about, they can give out certain information, certainly with like even chronic diseases, they claim to know what their causes are, and yet if you have a look deeply enough, you can find them making statements that, well, we don't know exactly what causes this, and it's etiology unknown, and those sorts of statements. They're littered, but you need to dig and look for them. So lots of contradictions, and certainly with the antibodies, completely contradictory statements. But as I say, neither of them is true, because, you know, it's just based on the completely false model of the germ theory.
And what we found out is, sure.
Yeah. So where do T cells fit in with this?
Well, they're T lymphocytes, so they come from I believe the thymus gland. They're white blood cells. They're supposed to attack antigens, but I mean, again, they're looked at in the wrong way, aren't they? They're just studied, because they're always studied from the starting point that they attack antigens, you know, that they defend the body by attacking it. So they're never studied from the right perspective, or even they're not even observed to see what they do, or studied to investigate what they do. They're only looked at from the basis of that's what they do, and now let's have a look at them in the petri dish and see what happens. But
and all sorts of rules get made up, usually by virologists, about what these things are, what they do, and they build up a whole fabricated so-called science based on fantasies.
Right. Focus.
Yeah. And this is the problem that we found all the way through. While we were doing the studies that we did over the years. So it's not only the contradictions, you've got to cut through the I hate to call it science, really, because it isn't. It's just the false stories that get put out and worked upon. And as we know, there's a whole industry called, I'll call it that, virology, a whole industry based on fantasies. And it amazed us how that can still carry on. I mean, there are certain doctors like Dr. Stefan Lanker, who's seen through that and refuses to be called a virologist anymore, because he realizes it's just nonsense. But as we found with our studies, because a lot of this antibody fallacy is talked about as regards immunity and the body's immune system. But as we found out, the body doesn't work that way. It doesn't have an immune system. It has a health system. You know, the body has a health system. You can't boost its immunity by poisoning it in some way with a vaccine to produce antibodies that are going to protect it some stage in the future. But it just doesn't work like that.
Can I make one point before we move on? That one of the things I discovered literally over the weekend, that I was looking at really trying to find out what size antibodies are, and obviously they're different sizes, these proteins, and some of them are as small as 10 nanometers. Now we know that at that size they can't be viewed by any kind of visual means except through electron microscope, which means that the idea that they actually do something or they have any kind of activity has never actually been observed, because no activity is actually viewed under electron microscope. They're always it's in a vacuum and they're bombarded by electrons, and they're only taken in sort of small slices. So these, whatever the molecules are, they're never viewed in action. nothing is viewed in action under an electron microscope. So how they determine the activity of these molecules within the body remains rather sort of questionable. So that, as I say, it was just, I mean, these proteins are different sizes, but some of them are definitely too small to be seen with anything other than an electron microscope.
And as Don said,
and most of the videos you see of viruses attacking cells, etc., those are just computer generated graphics.
Absolutely.
It's
cartoons.
Cartoons, yes, exactly.
Yeah. And it just shows, I think, it's very indicative of the fraudulent nature, particularly of the mainstream media, and supported, of course, by officialdom, it putting that sort of thing out. You know, that's deliberately meant to mislead people into thinking that there's a science behind it, where they know what these things look like, and look, we can see them moving around and attacking things. Absolute nonsense, as Dawn said. You know, under an electron microscope, everything's dead, static, black and white. They've never seen any of these actions taking place of so-called viral particles attacking a cell. They've never seen any of this.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all the sorts of assumptions that they make from, well, dead and still black and white images. So, I mean, one of the things we'd like to talk about in this is a little more about the sort of fraudulent nature, and I use that word, fraudulent, because it is. It's not just mistaken. There's a deliberate effort to deceive, and it seems to have been more stepped up since. I mean, I know this whole coronavirus thing is a fraud in itself, and we've talked a little before, and I think most people are starting to get used to this idea that there's a great fraud going off with the information that's being given out to the public. But we've noticed that it's been stepped up a little, and I'd like to sort of give an example or two of that, of the fraudulent science. And I think because people see the work that we've put out, and they see the challenge that we've put out to say that there are no peer-reviewed scientific papers that prove that any virus has been proved to exist as a pathogen. Now, obviously, there are particles in the blood that virologists call viruses, but these are just proteins. They're just particles. They don't do anything. Only virologists think that they do something. But because there's more and more people getting used to this idea that there's no science behind viruses, occasionally people have sent us links to say, oh yes, we've seen on the internet that someone has produced a paper that says the coronavirus has been isolated, it meets Koch's postulates, and it's been proved to cause this disease. One of these papers has actually been printed in Nature, which is sort of the most prestigious science journal, supposedly, in the world. So one of these papers is there. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, most people, when they ever look at these papers, they only read the abstract, which is sort of a paragraph or maybe even two paragraphs right at the beginning, which purports to sort of outline what the scientific paper is about. And in this particular paper that was published in Nature, it says that the coronavirus has been isolated, it does meet Koch's postulates, and it has been proven to cause the disease. Okay, so you think, oh, okay. And that's all most people read, including doctors. But when you look further into the paper and read the methodology as to what they've actually done, you get a very different story. Unfortunately, people like Dr. Andy Kaufman and others, and we've looked at the paper too, can see quite definitely that within the methodology, they've not done any of those things. They haven't isolated it, or certainly not purified it. They haven't fully categorized its DNA and its makeup. It does not meet Koch's postulates, and it hasn't been proven to cause the disease. So completely in contradiction to what they've put in the abstract. And in that particular paper, the people who did these tests actually admit that themselves in the methodology that they haven't met Koch's postulates, they didn't actually purify it, and it hasn't been proven to cause the disease. So you think, how can this be in a scientific paper published in Nature? That, to me, that is complete fraud, to put an abstract that says they've done all these things, and then in the methodology of the same paper, by the same people, admit that they haven't done any of those things. Because they obviously believe, and it's obviously happened, they've deceived a lot of people, including doctors, who only read the abstract and think it's all been done. Now, to me, that shows not only a deep level of fraud by the establishment, it's certainly not science, and well, it's utter lies, to be blunt, but it also, I think, shows the desperation now that the establishment is willing to stoop to, because they're, I think, becoming under more attack from people like ourselves and yourself and others that are saying, show us the science. Where's the science to prove what you're saying? Because we know it's not there. And so they're coming up with this sort of fraudulent method. And so that's just one example, really. There are others, what I think is all indicative of the types of fraud, and that is by the non-reporting of any of this by the mainstream media. I mean, I'm sure people must have noticed that there's never any debates in the mainstream media in any format, whether it's TV or radio or newspapers. There's never any debates where anyone's given the chance to say, well, actually, there's an alternative view here as to what's going off with this coronavirus pandemic. No one's ever given the opportunity to question it, or to put up, certainly not to ask the questions, well, where's the science, and try and get either a political party member to come up with the science, or doctors to come up with the science. You never see any of this, so it's very much one-sided. None of the mass protests which have been going on around the world all the time over the months, I mean, there's one in London every weekend, tens of thousands of people attend and completely block off Trafalgar Square protesting about this. You never see it in the media. In Germany, in Berlin in particular, right through the summer, there's been huge protests, with over 1 million people in Berlin protesting against these lockdowns and the lack of science to back up anything that the government's doing. And now you would have thought, when you get in 1 million people protesting against anything, you'd have thought it would have been mainstream covered because it's such a huge amount of people with a common purpose. And yet you don't see any of it in the mainstream media. So again, yet another indication of just how fraudulent the whole establishment is in hiding this sort of thing from the public.
And this is going on all around the world. I mean, there's protests going on in Australia, Germany, London, like you said, Canada, in the United States. Of course, you don't see it on the mainstream media, for sure.
Yeah. And this ought to say to people, there's something very fraudulent going on. Why are they not showing you this? This is stuff that's really happening, but you never see it. So that just shows you that there's, I think, a hidden agenda and a conspiracy by the whole of the establishment to hide the truth from the public.
That's probably why, they stoop to the level of trying to put something in Nature so that everyone says, oh, well, it's Nature, it's the most prestigious medical journal, so, it has to be true, in the same way as, oh, well, if the BBC report it, it must be true. So, I think it's a sign that, as David said before, it's a sort of desperation, but I think it's also a good sign that the message is getting out, that there is something seriously wrong with what they've been saying about this so-called virus. But they go to the extent of there was actually a German doctor who was supposed to be speaking in London a couple of weeks ago, and he was arrested and he was held in a UK police station. Well, he was arrested and held for 22 hours.
Yeah.
So yes, and with
he was denied any access to a lawyer. He wasn't even allowed to phone his wife to say what had happened to him, and he was kept in solitary cell, really, on his own, and denied all access to anyone. He was arrested and handcuffed and sort of basically chucked into a van by people who are not even sure. They were riot police, dressed as riot police. People are not really sure whether they were. But that was a completely illegal arrest. Unfortunately, he has got now some legal representation who are going to sue the Metropolitan Police, this is the London Police, for illegal arrest. Now, because that was totally illegal. You can't just arrest someone for speaking in Trafalgar Square. Certainly not that. I mean, I know
he was at Speaker's Corner, which is supposed to be where people are allowed free speech, and no, that was and again a doctor who was going to be speaking out. So yeah, definitely there's some real problems there.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry.
So again, that shows where someone who they consider important, a doctor in this case, who knows what he's talking about and can give proper information about the lack of science behind this so-called fake virus, and of course they want to shut him up. And it shows that they're quite prepared to do totally illegal things, even under their so-called special measures that the UK government has put in place. What they did there is still illegal, so they're breaking their own laws. And I think, again, not only is this disgraceful, but just shows that what they're prepared to do anywhere in the world is nothing to do with the law. It's pure sort of fascist tactics, and people need to be aware of this. Okay, so I mean, fortunately, we've also come across some information that, but I think, yes, there's a doctor who's, a doctor in law who's putting a class action together.
Yes, I've seen that, and I posted his video actually on my Facebook page.
Okay, well, I think people need to.
Very useful.
It gives some hope, I think. And not that I trust the legal system, because I don't. It's shown itself to, as I've just said, to be completely corrupt and act illegally. The whole thing they've done is illegal. But I was interested to see that what they seem to be pinning their class action on is the fact that the governments of the world, if you like, have acted fraudulently and illegally by the use of the PCR test. And what they're looking to do is to prosecute them under the fact that, certainly at the World Health Organization level and the upper echelons, if you like, of the medical establishment, they are well aware that the PCR test is totally unreliable for testing whether someone's positive with coronavirus, totally useless. And because they can prove that these people in the higher echelons know this, then they can prove that they've acted in a fraudulent way and therefore are open to prosecution. So they've not gone down the avenue of the virus doesn't exist. They've gone down the route of that it's fraudulent use of the PCR test to give false information and to bring in measures which are totally disproportionate to what's required. So it'll be interesting to see if they can do that. I sincerely hope they do. It's quite a large team of lawyers, I think, that have got together, and they're looking to do it as a class action, which they can't do under German law, but can under US law and Canadian law. So I think that's where they're going to bring the class action against these people. So it'd be nice to think that some of these psychopaths that are running this show actually end up in prison. I'd very much like to see that. And it would sort of give everyone a little hope that there is some justice after all, because we've not seen any of it so far.
Not at all.
Another little indication of the fraudulent way the system is going. I don't know. I think most people have probably heard of Dr. Andy Kaufman now. He's quite well known around the internet. But it was interesting to see. I saw him saying a few weeks ago that I think in his area some people had wanted to put a case together, which they took to court to show the dangers of forcing their school children to wear masks. I mean, as we know, it's one is they'd be completely ineffectual, and two is they're actually hazardous to health. And they wanted to show this in a court of law. And as Dr. Kaufman, as well as being an MD, is also a qualified psychiatrist. And so he was being called as an expert witness to show the sort of psychological damage as well as the health damages to children. And even though for many years he's been accepted as an expert witness, qualified as an expert witness, the judge refused to accept him as an expert witness on the basis that he had sort of crazy ideas about germs not causing disease. And and so therefore,
Amazing.
one is, well, Dr. Kaufman has got the qualifications to be able to make those decisions. The judge certainly hasn't. What does the judge know about germs and disease? But that just shows again, so they wouldn't allow him to be an expert witness. So causing great trouble, of course. And again, this is just another little example of how corrupt the system is at the judicial level and how desperate they are to stop the truth coming out. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of quite worrying, really, to see that they're doing this.
Absolutely.
I don't know whether you'd like to add anything to that, Bob.
No, you're doing great, and keep going. Lots of good information.
You happy with that?
Yeah,
okay.
no. Yes, I was just going to say the idea that somebody can be suitably qualified as an expert witness, 1 week and a few weeks down the line, suddenly they're not, just because they may have a slightly different view. It really is worrying that these decisions can be made at that kind of level, but it does certainly show that there is something changing. People are beginning to learn that there's something going wrong here, or there's something wrong that's going on, and obviously they're trying to do as much as they can to stop anything from being allowed through the court system in case it sets a precedent that then everyone else can use. So it's, even though it's worrying to a certain extent, it certainly, you can glean some kind of hope from it, from the fact that they are trying even harder to clamp down, because more people are learning that there's a problem, and that's good news.
It's quite interesting as well if people cast their minds back to October of last year, when I think most people have probably seen on the internet the so-called Event 201, that the authorities were all sat around a table, the Bill Gates type people, planning what at that time they said was, what would we do if there was some sort of pandemic, caused by a virus? And they had set out a whole plan of, coincidentally, they said it would arise in China from bats or something like that, and then spread around the world and kill millions of people. And what sort of plans should we put in place? And it was only a few months later, of course, then that's exactly what happened, and people shouldn't forget that that's too much of a coincidence. But one of the things that they said in that, of course, was that they would have to take complete control of the media and make sure that there was blanket, basically suppression of alternative views being put out as to what could be going off, and that they would want to sort of really hammer it home, sort of almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as to, the seriousness of the coronavirus. And of course, that's, again, exactly what they've done. You can't put any program on almost now, certainly no news program, without them just talking almost incessantly about coronavirus. And of course, you've got the same thing in the whole of the mainstream media. It's complete blanket of any alternative views, and complete overall swamping of the airwaves and the newspapers and magazines of coronavirus and all the various restrictions that's going to be put out, as well as all the dire consequences that are going to happen if you don't obey these rules. You'll be sort of killing your grandma or something like that, if you don't wear masks or you don't keep your social distance. I mean, terrible things that they're putting on people. Even at one stage saying that children are the spreaders, they're the ones that are going to be. And then, of course, they've completely changed their mind now, certainly in the UK, and said that children under 11 can't actually get the virus. How they've come by that, I don't know.
Yeah, they keep changing the rules weekly, it seems. And it's funny. What's that expression? Tell a big enough lie often enough and people will buy it.
And I think it was Adolf Hitler who said that.
Yes.
Yes, and that's their playbook. That's their playbook. But the other thing is that they keep changing, not just changing their minds, but then they change the rules that affects, whether people are free to do things, not free to do things. So they allow a bit of freedom, and people start, they've started sort of, opening businesses and starting to function. Won't say normally, because we're not there yet. And now it seems that certainly in the UK there are going, well, as from today, I think there are going to be some more reports about the restrictions in certain parts of the country. So for some reason, even though viruses don't tend to stop at borders. No, I mean, there's these particles that are called viruses don't do anything anyway. But even by their own kind of ideas and theories, viruses are supposed to just spread. So how they only affect certain areas, even within a small country like the UK, there are, why they stop at sort of county borders, I've no idea, but certain areas seem to be more affected, which is just ludicrous. I mean, I think you've got the same in America, with different states having different kind of regulations and different sort of ideas, and some are more relaxed and some are less relaxed, and as if there are any kind of viruses that affect within certain states. So it is very confusing, and I don't know if that's all part of it, because we know that there are a lot of different stories that are going around about whether a virus exists, and whether it's a bioweapon, or whether it's been intentionally introduced, or where it's been created, or whether it's whether there is a disease, or what actually. So there's a lot of confusing information and conflicting information. So the general public, who aren't necessarily looking into these things, are easily confused. And that's one of the things that we like to do when we talk about things, is to keep things as simple as possible, and to say quite clearly that there is no evidence that these particles called viruses, cause disease. And if anyone's saying there is, then please present the evidence.
There is.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, I was just thinking when you said that, Dr. Thomas Cohen, in one of his videos, it's a great analogy. He talks about ping pong balls and a bucket. And he says, if I had a glass or brick wall and I threw a bunch of ping pong balls at it, they would bounce off and nothing would happen. But if I mixed rocks with those ping pong balls and threw them at the wall, well, it wouldn't be the ping pong balls breaking the wall or the glass, it would be the rocks. And he says that's exactly what they're doing in the laboratory, the virologists. They're not just taking isolated particles, what they call the virus, and putting them, introducing them into the culture. They're putting in this substance that has antibiotics, other toxic materials, which are the things that are actually affecting the cell, not the particles that are in the solution with it. So the whole thing is hocus pocus. And since most people don't know what's going on in the virologist laboratory, they just accept that it's true. I mean, the first comment I get from most people is, well, why would they lie to us? You mean all these years we've been lied to? All these doctors, it can't be. Why would they do that? It's just that people can't even fathom it.
Well, they don't. I mean, you're quite right there, Bob. And they can't. They can't accept that the way this works is that because doctors themselves think they're doing the right thing because that's how they've been taught, and they believe in viruses because that's what they learned in medical school. They haven't done any research themselves to actually find out if these things exist, and that's why we keep turning it back on them and saying, show us the science. Where is the science? But of course they tend to turn a deaf ear to that, because their whole world would collapse if they looked at the science and realized it wasn't there.
But with the virologists, as you're saying, it's not so much that they're telling lies. They've been taught to follow certain procedures, and they believe if they follow these procedures, then that produces a particular result, which they interpret to mean, so like the virus has been isolated. So they say, well, we followed the procedures, and that means, that we've got virus isolation. So it's not that they're deliberately lying, they're following their procedures, and they believe that the results that they've got have some kind of meaning. But it's interesting that if you look at a lot of actual study articles, these sort of the papers that the scientists put out, they occasionally put in words such as might be, could be, indicates, show that, possibly, those kinds of words. So they're not necessarily definitive, and quite often they also kind of make sure that their career continues by suggesting that well, we need more research into this particular area, and this must be investigated further. So they're keeping their careers going.
But this is fraud. It's not science.
Well, I wasn't suggesting that it was correct, but it's just keeping things going because they want to keep studying it, but they're starting from the wrong point.
Yeah, but it is, yes. Those procedures that Dawn was talking about, virologists follow, are not scientific, and this is what we've been trying to get to people to look at all the time. Their opinions based on assumptions, based on fantasies. It's not proper science, and until they actually get to the stage where they're actually producing proper scientific results, then this whole mess will continue. We are sort of, because they, within the UK that is, and in particular in Scotland, which people may realise is a part of the UK, for those that are not don't know the sort of geography of where we live, there are some sort of good signs, because they seem to keep, first of all, within the UK, they always try these new draconian measures in the north of England, Scotland, before they try it in the south of England, London, area where we are. I don't know quite why they do this, but they always try to do this, and they're just bringing in some more draconian measures in Scotland, and the people, because they're wrecking all the businesses, of course, and people are really, really fed up with it. So at last, it's driven them to start to ask now for the government to come up with the scientific evidence to justify the measures that they're taking. So to us, this is a glimmer of light that at last the public are starting to ask the questions we've been trying to get them to ask for months now. Is ask your government for the scientific evidence. Get them to show you the scientific evidence that where they're saying a virus exists, it's been proved to exist, it causes the disease, and that these measures that we're doing will actually prevent its spread. Let's see the scientific evidence for it, because we know there isn't any, of course, but at least if people start pressurizing their government with those very specific questions, and I would recommend everyone everywhere, everyone listening to this podcast, whatever country they're in, is to get those questions addressed to your governments. Where is the science to justify these draconian measures that you're taking? And not least of all, where's the evidence that there is a pathogenic viral particle at the basis of it all?
And the problem is that for many, many years, since our childhood in elementary school, they teach us that diseases are caused by viruses, bacteria. So it's so ingrained in people that it's a hard one to shake. It really is. And so most people don't even consider challenging. That's like a law of science. Viruses cause disease. We all know that. So that's what makes this difficult, exposing the hoax of this whole thing, is you really have to get to ground zero, and there's a lot of conditioning to work through.
Yeah, they'd sooner not believe anything. There's enough people telling them that there's a problem with this, not just us. There's lots of people telling the general public that there's a real problem with what the governments are doing. But the majority of people just don't want to listen. They just don't want to listen at all. They don't want to look at the evidence, because I think there's a problem where they realise that if the lies that the government and establishment are putting out, if when they are proved to be true, they realise that their whole world will fall apart. Everything they thought they knew about reality, if you like, political and medical, is wrong. And that's I'll say a bitter pill to swallow, since it certainly is. And I think that's the problem. I've had people say this to me. If I believe that that's true, that they're lying to us, the implications of that are enormous. And I said, yes, they are enormous. I think most people don't realise just how much the authorities lie to us about everything of any importance. And they're aided and abetted by the mainstream media, which of course is completely controlled. And so you only get a very, very lopsided view of what's really going on. And this goes right back to any sort of major event you'd like to talk about, whether it's from the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, 9/11, anything you'd like to mention.
Yes.
We are not officially told the truth about anything. And you can find out a lot of the truth if people dig, but most people don't want to be bothered.
And then you're a conspiracy theorist.
Exactly.
Yes, but it's the sort of psychological. It scares them that things that they have utterly believed in might not be true, because it takes them right out of their comfort zone, which is where a lot of people like to stay. They don't want to look at it, so they don't even want to even look into the information for themselves. Unfortunately, now's not the time to keep your head in the sand. Now's the time to really stop doing that, because this is now what's going on is now everywhere. It's affecting everyone, and it's only going to get worse unless people start really looking at it properly and realizing that there is a big problem. I mean, there are so many sort of minor aspects that people can even start to question. I mean, for example, the whole point that this is supposed to be viral, and yet everyone's using antibacterial hand sanitizers. Well, it doesn't take an awful lot of effort to know that antibacterial products don't affect, they're admitted not to even affect so-called viral diseases, for the same reason that doctors don't prescribe antibiotics for so-called viral infections, so-called. So that bacteria and viruses are supposed to be different. They're supposed to require different treatments. So why are people using antibacterial hand sanitizers for something that's supposed to be a viral disease? Just a simple question like that, for people to say, oh yes, okay, I hadn't thought about that. I think to start digging deeper from there.
Yeah, I think I'd probably just like to bring up an article that came to our attention this month, actually, and it's written by two German guys, Thorsten Engelbrecht and Klaus Kernlein, who's an MD. And people may know them best for their book, which has come back into the market again, The Virus Myth.
Yes, great book.
Virus Mania, sorry. Virus Mania.
That's right.
Now, they've written a very interesting paper, which people might like to look up on the internet, which they looked into, because we were told about these peaks in death rates when coronavirus came on the scene. And they looked at the various statistics that had been put out in practically all the countries in Europe, okay, to see just what periods they were, what the peaks were, how long they lasted, and what was actually going off. And it's quite surprising, really, cutting a long story short. The so-called death peaks only occurred over roughly a 2-week period in April 2020. Okay, so not as we've sort of led to believe there's a great peak that's been ongoing and rising all the time. There was just this peak over roughly a 2-week period in April 2020. And as they found out, it's coincided with various experimental drug regimes that various medical establishments were carrying out in all of these countries. So they all coincided, these little peaks, these 2-week peaks, coincided at the same time. And they looked into what was happening, because this is, of course, when the coronavirus scare, if you like, was first perpetrated on the public. So these groups of doctors doing these experiments were sort of given permission to basically to throw any drugs they liked at the people that were coming in with supposed coronavirus. And they were quite a toxic cocktail mix of drugs. One of which was this one that we hear a lot about at the moment called hydroxychloroquine. Okay. Now, you know, I know there's quite a few people on the internet who are sort of recommending that hydroxychloroquine is an effective treatment for coronavirus. Okay. Well, we would say, well, how can it be? You know, the virus doesn't exist, so why can you treat it with anything? I mean, and hydroxychloroquine, as people probably know, it's a malaria drug. I mean, that's what it's supposed to be. But it's known to, even by the manufacturer's own admission, it's known to cause a heart arrhythmia, okay, in a normal dose. And if you exceed that dose, it will cause heart attacks, i.e. it will kill people. And this is what was happening with the toxic mix of drugs that these, I'll say they were just experimenting on people that were coming in with supposed coronavirus. They were giving him high doses of hydroxychloroquine and various antibiotics. Some of the drugs that they were using were what they call off-label, i.e. not even recommended for that use by the manufacturers. So they were just really carrying out really unethical experiments on people with these drug cocktails to see what would happen. And hence what they were doing was killing these people. And hence this peak of deaths, supposedly from coronavirus, over this 2-week period in April, which coincided with, and there was at least half a dozen countries all doing this at the same time. And the death peaks all occurred at the same time until they were basically stopped from doing it.
Including the use of ventilators as well.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. It was a combination of all these different treatments. So really, you can say, you know, these peaks were down to iatrogenesis. Really,
well, and also coupled with the fact that they were monkeying around with the death certificates and labeling people COVID, labeling them as COVID deaths when they really weren't. So there's a lot of factors that go into that mix that created that peak and continue to have the death count go on.
Well, I think because of what was going off with these, I'll call them drug trials on people in this 2-week period, I think that's why it's particularly interesting to look at this 2-week period right across Europe in the different countries. It was simultaneous while they were doing these drug trials in these different countries when they had this first initial peak. Okay. And as Dawn rightly said, it's quite obvious they were being killed by the drugs and procedures that were being put in place by the doctors. And we also saw that in the Lancet, which is sort of the prestigious medical magazine in the UK, and this was a study by them, that in February, it showed that out of 22 intubated patients, that's the ventilators, only 3 of them survived. 3 out of 22. Now, you can start to see where these high death figures are coming from. You know, they're not coming from any virus, which we know doesn't exist anyway. They're not even coming from any known disease that the medical establishment would recognize. They're coming purely from the drug treatment and the ventilator treatment by the medical establishment. You know, it is, as Dawn said, using the correct term, iatrogenesis, which is basically death by the medical establishment. And this is quite horrendous. But of course, as someone has often quipped, you know, the medical establishment can always bury their mistakes. And of course, that's exactly what they do. And just call it coronavirus.
Right, exactly. And also I want to add, not just in the hospitals, but in the nursing homes, they were over drugging the elderly who are already sick. had one foot in the grave, and then just giving them extra drugs. And a lot of them were neglected because the personnel was afraid to get near them because they were so filled with this fear of the coronavirus. So these people were neglected, overdrugged, et cetera, et cetera. And these, again, they were people who were very sick to begin with. So that added to the mix.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you say, the fear as well. So, you know, we know how effective the, you know, nocebo effect can, or rather how the nocebo effect can affect people's health. And so, you know, bringing that into the mix, because they were talking about, you know, a pandemic, it was going to kill millions of people. And, you know, a lot of people would have become really, really scared about that. You know, just somebody sneezing on them could have made them go into some kind of traumatic kind of fear kind of, I don't know what the right word is, be overtaken by the fear, really. And then that can generate physical symptoms that can then be assumed to be this deadly disease, and it can take them down all kinds of routes, certainly including taking various medications that would have helped to worsen the condition of their bodies and take them into serious illness, if not actual death as well. And we know that there have been plenty of people who have reacted to the draconian measures by taking their own lives, which is just dreadful. You know, but they've been put into such awful situations that, you know, they thought that taking their own life was a way out. So
I mean, we're told that there's been a 30% increase in suicides in the US. We know that the suicide rates increased in the UK as well, but I don't have a figure for that. But I have reliable information from the police that this is the case. And this is all due to the fear-mongering by the establishment, and particularly the mainstream media, which is disgraceful. You know, they're causing real deaths, whereas COVID isn't, because it doesn't exist, you know. I think it's worth pointing out, of course, that the so-called symptoms of COVID are sort of symptoms that could be caused by almost anything. You know, the sort of congestion and mucus production, coughs, sneezes, sore throats. I mean, all of those sort of symptoms which are being related to COVID, as symptoms of having COVID, can be caused by anything, you know. I mean, if you poison the body for any reason, those sort of symptoms will occur. So they can also occur from, of course, extra exposures to EMFs, electromagnetic fields. And of course, we know that there's been an increase in the exposure from not only Elon Musk's increasing number of satellites that he's putting up there, bombarding the whole of the world with additional microwaves, but with the rollout of 5G. So there's been a big increase in EMF exposure to people, which again can cause many of these symptoms. And I think it's also worth reminding people, because it's not talked about very much now, and that people may remember about HARP, that high frequency oral research program that the military have had. And they've got these HARP systems in various places around the world, particularly a huge one in Alaska, which beams out high energy radio waves, which they bounce off the ionosphere, and they can direct them into virtually any place in the world. Now, this, of course, is also going to have an effect on people. And who knows if they are using this covertly to intensify what might be called COVID symptoms. Very easy to do. If they want to highlight an area, if they wanted to do this, they could do it. We know that they have very little respect for humanity. So who knows? And of course, this could give them the excuse for a so-called second wave, third wave, whatever they want to manufacture. You know, well, again, nothing to do with a virus.
Mm-hmm. Also coupled with, they're doing, well, what people call chemtrails, which again, they say that's conspiracy theory, but they've actually issued reports saying they're doing experiments to try to limit global warming by putting particulates, aluminum particulate matter in the atmosphere to reflect the sunlight back and help, abate that. And God only knows what's in those chemtrails and what the actual purpose is and how that combines with the electromagnetic frequencies and all the other toxins we're exposed to, the glyphosate in the food. And I mean, it's just unbelievable the amount of toxins people are exposed to these days, from the water supply, the food supply, the air supply. I mean, it's almost unavoidable.
Yeah. And
they blame it on a virus.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, so it's a good cover, really. And you think, we've seen this happen in other parts of the world where, there might have been chemical spills or something going off, or just farmers spraying the fields with some new insecticide, and suddenly lots of people go down with an illness. And of course, it's very convenient to blame it on a virus, because as people often say, you can't sue a virus, but you can certainly sue a chemical company or a pharmaceutical company. And we could be looking at something again here where if a number of people in a particular area do become ill, it's very easy now to blame it on COVID rather than electromagnetic frequencies that have been stepped up for whatever reason, whether it's new 5G transmitters or Elon Musk satellites or HARP. So it's a nice cover story, really, which we need to sort of think about and see what, and that's why it's very important for people to look at what the real reasons are as to why people may get ill. We're not denying that people get ill. Of course they do. People get ill and die and have done always, but it's what those reasons are. And that's really what, coming back to our book, what our book's about, is to look at those reasons and eliminate the ones that we know it's not. And that's what we spent 10 years doing. We can eliminate the reasons that it's not. And so then you'll have to look at what's left. And sure, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, yes, people are getting sick. And again, I think we need to stress that flu symptoms in general are the body trying to eliminate toxins and debris. That's what it is. And people say, oh, people die of the flu. Well, they don't die of the flu. They die of the toxins and the debris that the body's trying to eliminate, coupled with all the drugs they're getting and all the other procedures that are actually stopping the body from doing what it wants to do. And it just, at the end, it just gives up. And the person dies, especially if they already have other pre-existing illnesses. But if it's managed properly, the flu is actually a good thing. It's your body cleansing. And the old-time hygienic doctors like Dr. Troll, Dr. Tilden, Herbert Shelton, many other hygienic doctors, they would immediately fast the person, put them on a fast, stop all food, bed rest, just clean water, fresh air, and usually within a few days the person was totally over it and like brand new, because again, it's a positive process. It's a cleansing. It's a rejuvenation process. But the fact that people fear it, the fact that people don't manage it properly, in addition to which throw in all these drugs, and I'm not talking about just the drugs that the doctors give by prescription, but most people, as soon as they get a sniffle or a cough, they run to the drugstore, take this, take that. It's like they immediately try to start suppressing it, and that starts the downhill spiral. So if people just understood what the flu is, or many of these symptoms, and just started working in harmony with your body and doing the right things, they wouldn't be dying. Let's put it that way.
You're absolutely right.
And the symptoms would abate automatically, and they'd be better off for it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Bob. I mean, and that's what we try to point out in our book. Only the body can heal itself, and all as you have to do as a person is to give it the right environment to do that, and not least of which is the right amount of nutrition, which we've talked about many times. And as we know, we're all vegans. We know that a plant-based diet is the best way. Organic, raw food as much as possible gives the body the right levels of nutrition so that it can deal with these toxins. And as you say, give it bed rest, and your so-called flu symptoms or cold symptoms or any symptoms will abate if you look after the body properly, let it do what it does best. Don't suppress what it's trying to do, eliminate the toxins with over-the-counter drugs or stuff from your GP. As we've said many times, unfortunately, the medical establishment don't understand the human body. They don't understand how it works, and they think they've just got to give it some lotion or potion to kill something so that the body can get better. And it just
Yes,
doesn't work that way.
with the idea that you know, these lotions and potions will fight the disease, but they mustn't be too strong to make sure they don't actually, you know, kill the patient. So it's, you know, fighting the disease without killing the patient. And the idea that, you know, poisons can be used to create health is just so ludicrous once you really understand or really look into it. But, you know, that's why, you know, we said, you know, everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong, is because disease isn't something that attacks the body that then has to be fought. As you quite rightly say, you know, what we think of as disease are sets of symptoms that that are natural for the body, because that's what, well, the body needs to get rid of the toxins because it's looking after itself. I mean, the medical establishment just doesn't accept that the body has any ability whatsoever. You know, it's just a bag of chemicals, or it's some kind of machine of different parts that, you know, can't do anything, whereas the body's actually amazing, and it has far more ability, far more intelligence, far more ability than is given credit for, and it's very capable of looking after itself. But the one thing that, you know, people need to do is not to poison it, and to, you know, minimize exposures to poisons. I mean, it's like you say, with the sort of geoengineering and stuff in the atmosphere and in the water, you know, it might seem impossible, but there are things that people can do. You know, trying to minimize their exposures, which means really concentrating on everything they put both in their body and on their body. You know, and that even goes to, you know, the clothes you wear, you know, everything in your home that you have control over. And people certainly have a lot more control over the products that they use and take and eat and drink and everything than they may think, and that can have a, you know, quite an amazing effect, and produce an improvement to their health if they really look at what they're doing and what they're using, but certainly what they're eating, you know, now more than ever.
And like you're saying, there's so many things we can do to protect our health and to increase our health, and yet mainstream media is leading people astray by having them put masks on, use these chemical hand sanitizers, and all these other things that are not only not helping them, but they're hurting them. So it's just, again, bad information, and people just unaware and following it, and it's just sowing the seeds for, you know, more illness.
Exactly.
And that'll be the second wave.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as well, we're going to see an uprise in mental health problems as well, because the things that are happening, and with keeping families apart, you know, I mean, human beings are social animals, and these measures that are being put in place by the governments are breaking up those social bonds, not only within the family, but just normal human interaction. And again, I think that's deliberate, but it's going to, particularly with children who are impressionable, you know, and are seeing people walking about with these horrible masks on, particularly these hideous black ones, which depersonalize people. You know, what must they think? So I think this is going to be very detrimental. So if we don't bring this to an end very quickly, then we're going to have a whole load of mental health problems cropping up over the next generation. Okay, well, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that, Bob, but I think for this particular one, we've probably said all we want to say for now.
Yeah, we've covered everything, and I think it's been a great interview, definitely.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob, for having us to talk to, and let's hope that people will start educating themselves, finding out some information. They can come to our website at whatreallymakesyouill.com. Lots of free information there. They'll be able to see this video and others, and hopefully start to look into things themselves, because it needs everyone to get together and start to push back against these draconian measures that are being inflicted on them, because it's not only detrimental to everyone's health, it's taking away their freedoms, you know. and this is something that we must not accept. So
Mhm.
let's hope people will do that.
Yes. Well, great. Well, look forward to our next interview, and thank you very much. It was very informative. Very good.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Bob. Bye for
All
now.
right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.